tutto.
È iniziata l'era della fibra di Open Fiber, l'era di enti e imprese più digitali, dove i servizi sono sempre accessibili e il territorio è monitorato in tempo reale. Attiva la fibra con il tuo operatore di fiducia su openfiber.it. Vivi l'era della fibra.
Quello che state per intraprendere è un viaggio nel tempo, un percorso dei ricordi attraverso oggetti che nel passato facevano parte della nostra quotidianità, ma che il progresso ha consegnato all'oblio.
Luisa.
Carlo.
Compleanno.
Cos'è sto posto? Mi manca. Mi vuoi sposare?
Sono Orogel. Sono pronto ad accogliervi con verdure dal sapore unico che scaldano il cuore. Pronto a farvi sentire i profumi della campagna, anche in città. Ad essere il tocco di gusto alle vostre ricette. Orogel, non solo pronto, pronto a tutto.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.
Potete anche... Buonasera.
Good evening and welcome to this session on Europe's competitiveness in the age of artificial intelligence. I would like to thank and welcome our guest speakers, Luca Beccari, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of San Marino, Francesco Billari, Vice Chancellor of the Università Bocconi, Enzo Moavero Milanesi, President of UNIDROIT and Professor of European Union Law at LUIS,
Pina,
Pina Picierno, Vice President of the European Parliament, Massimiliano Salini, Vice President of the EPP Group at the European Parliament, and Uljan Sharka, CEO of the Domyn Corporation, and Mr. Sharka is connected online. Welcome. Right now, Europe is the only space at world level where the rule of law, democracy, and universal welfare coexist. This system needs a strong and solid and competitive economic base by its very nature, because if we only focus on welfare, on pensions, on health sectors or university, school systems, and all the social support and so on and so forth, without an economic base that can finance, can support all this, well, it would be unimaginable and it would collapse very fast. So when we talk about competitiveness, we don't just talk about the kind of profit a company may make. We are talking about a whole system that we may call a European system, which is unique in the world and that must compete and affirm itself before China, the United States. There are some allies, but Europe is more often than not in a situation that it has to establish itself, to affirm itself before the other international partners. Of course, the competitive situation is strongly influenced by the ability to compete at a technological level right now. So here is my very first question to Francesco Billari. Could you please provide us with a brief framework of how you see right now the European situation between these big poles which tend to keep it under pressure? Where is Europe now? Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I am professor of demography, so I we'll have to talk about people and probably the human capital, which is at the basis of competitiveness and a possible answer to artificial intelligence. I talk about European records. We had the swimming and athletics championships, and the first record in Europe is that despite the demographic winter, we have 450 million inhabitants in the European Union, and that's a record number. It won't continue to be like this probably, but if we count them all together, if we put us together, we are a particularly strong power. The problem is when we ask politicians to what extent we can consider that a unified force. And then we have a problem of duration of life, 82 years average life duration. We have never been so, we have never lived so long. So we have different potential for competitiveness here and a different potential for responding to economic challenges, because we will need to have the capacity to include different generations as a result of this that can age so long. And then, unfortunately, we have not so many children. 1.4 is the average number in Europe. In Italy, it's even lower, but I'll talk about Europe. And that's evidence of low competitiveness. And the combination between long life and low fertility tells us that we are the second most aged economic entity in the world. It means that we have not so many young people, 22% of people over 65 years. Only Japan has a higher number with 30%, and this is a very big challenge with respect to what we have mentioned before. How can we do when we have not so many young people and so many elderly people to respond to the competition of China that is going towards this too, but slowly and with different numbers, or the United States that are a much younger country? The key would be investing in human capital. That is a clear answer to generate competitiveness, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And here too we have a record. If we look at young Europeans, they have never been so well educated. 44% of young European people have a university degree. Italy lags behind. Let's remember this, but 44% is a big number. And with respect to competitiveness, let's consider Chinese people who are 24 years old. That's a study done by colleagues in Bocconi. 24 years old people in China have a degree, a university diploma, in terms of more than 70%. So these Eastern countries are responding to the limited number of young people by investing a lot in education. And we are doing this more than before, but not at the right pace at the European level. Let's go back for a moment. We have managed to create a European university system in some way with a credit system, even if at the European level we don't really invest in university. We have never thought about creating a European school system, which is quite strange, because consider the movement of workers. Workers normally should be able to travel with their own families. And if they travel with their own families, what does that mean? That a million plus Romanian people who are based in Italy, they had to take their kids with them, and they had to let them attend a school system that is completely different. So we have, on the one hand, a university system that is not able to compete with our competitors, and it is not future-proof. That's the first aspect to be considered with respect to people, I think. And then the other aspect I would like to talk about is entrepreneurship. Europe is very much fragmented in terms of what it means to have business, to do business. Now, maybe with the 28th regime, something will be different in this respect, but maybe Uljan then will tell us about starting a startup, starting from Italy and then in Europe. But we have a situation that is also linked to the situation I mentioned before, that is low human capital, which is not favorable to the creation of new businesses. To conclude, I would like to mention the centrality of the university system. The university system must be central. This is not a conflict of interest in my case, but given that the topic is artificial intelligence, I must remind everybody that artificial intelligence was developed starting in the Silicon Valley. And the Silicon Valley is not just there because there is the Verrazzano Bridge in San Francisco, but basically because there are Stanford and Berkeley and an ecosystem that is so important and that we do not have in Europe. Our competitiveness right now must start off from schools and universities, human capital, people, and human intelligence. So to compete in the world of artificial intelligence, we need human intelligence, but we need to understand how to invest in this human intelligence. We can do that by pooling our forces. I was mentioning this to the president earlier. In Bocconi, we try to join forces with the Politecnico to create a foundation for entrepreneurship. So we have to be able to get together more and more at a European level to leverage competitiveness from our human intelligence, and we must absolutely consider schools and universities. Human intelligence for artificial intelligence. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this is a very important message because when people talk about competitiveness, often they talk about skills, but what you mentioned is about the source. So we go to the roots of competitiveness, which something that is never considered in the public debate. So thank you for being so clear. Now, Luca Beccari, San Marino is not as big as China, but it must be present in a world where there's China, the United States, Canada, and so many other countries. So you need partnerships where all the human capital that you have can be included in a virtuous path. How do you experience this need for a partnership? Thank you and good evening, everybody. Let me begin by saying that certainly San Marino is one of the smallest countries in the world and in the macro-European region. Well, it is also the oldest republic in the world. Indeed, it is the oldest republic. However, over the last few decades, we can say that the big challenges of our times are the same for all countries. Big countries, small countries, the scale can be different, but the 10 top priorities for countries like Italy, France, Germany, proportionately, they are the same for San Marino. We face the same issues, the energy crisis, employment issues, inflation, the quality of life of our citizens. It's all the same. How is all this addressed by a small-sized country with fewer means or with a smaller variety of means? Well, first, we try to understand how the paradigm has changed. The paradigm of competitiveness has shifted considerably. First, moving from traditional factors, countries offering fiscal differential used to be more competitive, but now this situation has evolved, and we consider the countries now that would offer a business environment, so a range of attractive factors. Today, new technologies have shifted this paradigm once more, and the competitiveness factor, unfortunately or luckily, is also linked strongly to the possibility of taking advantage of new technologies. So for a country now, it is absolutely important to have energy provision at low cost. Otherwise, data centers won't work. Up until 10 years ago, we were all trying to cable with optic fiber our towns, and now we are all running to build up data centers. So the competitive approach has changed dramatically. For sure, being aware of this is an important factor, and then being aware that we are not alone. This is true for San Marino, which has a traditional partnership which is less developed with respect to other European countries. We're not members of the European Union, but we will be associate country soon. So it is important to have synergies, and for us, historical, important and fundamental synergy has been the one with Italy that started long time ago. Now it continues, but it moves on to a wider context that is the one of the European Union. Often the EU is criticized because of their regulations, of the standards, and so on and so forth, and we see the matter the other way around. We are running behind, we're chasing the European Union in a way, because the EU can offer a market opportunity to San Marino or to other countries with similar features as San Marino, but also it can offer an environment to do business and for the economy that is more in line with our features. To conclude quickly, I can say this. We are used to measuring the wealth of a country on the basis of the GDP, and so far so good. But between having 12% the GDP and having 5% GDP, but perhaps on one side we have a condition of wealth that is not particularly qualified, and on the other side there may be less performance, but better quality of life for citizens. Well, I see a big difference. It's like having full employment, but maybe everybody's working with a job that they don't like. So maybe it's better to have some problems with employment, but having people working in a place that they love. That's what San Marino is attempting to do, and it's attempting to do this with friend countries and partners that share the same set of values, which is also what the Holy Father has prompted us to do both in San Marino and in Rimini, that is, being aware of new technologies, of course, is important, it's fundamental, but we can't forget of the human factor and that the person must stand at the center. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's now ask a question to Uljan Shark. First of all, thanks for being connected with us. We know that you are very busy. And I have the following question for you. With your company, Domyn, you are part of a big consortium called Europa that also sees the participation of the German Fraunhofer Institute. And you are this consortium aims to compete internationally in the fields of technology and artificial intelligence. You claimed that the famous AI Act Europe has just released is a competitive advantage. We were a bit surprised by this statement because, in fact, the AI Act has always been accused of limiting Europe's competitiveness. Can you please explain to us in brief what's your ambition as a company internationally and how Europe can help you rather than being an obstacle for you? So thanks a lot. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invitation and for allowing me to be connected from remote. The AI ecosystem in Europe is actually undeniable, but the AI gap between Europe and the other countries in this respect is undeniable. But this can become a competitive advantage. We like to divide to actually talk about abduction of artificial intelligence and production, so the training of large language of models and distribution. If we talk about adoption, and we forget about the fact that Europe has a number of gaps to bridge, for example, the capital gap, the calculation gap, and so on. From the point of view of adoption, Europe is bound to become the largest case study for artificial intelligence in the world. The ecosystem is the most fragmented one. We have 27 countries with a language and regulation complexity which is undeniable, and there artificial intelligence is the perfect tool to solve all the challenges we've been talking about for over 15 years. So, for example, the single digital market, thanks to the integration of systems enabled by artificial intelligence. I mean, in that case, we will be able to integrate the European digital market much faster, in a much faster way, especially because now we have generative AI, and this solves a fundamental issue, which is that of language. So potentially there will be an Italian, a German, a French, finalizing transactions at a much speedier pace compared, and this thanks to the software. The software is an operational system for the world. I mean, if it is not working, all activities, all businesses in a number of fields are stalled. So the artificial intelligence aims at facilitating the adoption of software, and Europe, in terms of the economy, has had to face a challenge in the last 20 years compared to the United States and China. In terms of regulation and physical fragmentation of the market. So from this standpoint, since AI manages to perfectly reduce complexities, we're bound to have a competitive advantage. And this can be applied also to the capital market, because artificial intelligence sort of introduces a standardization of companies. So it also provides for the uniformity of business activities. So in terms of adoption, Europe is already bound to be on the winning side. In terms of production, well, here we can identify the biggest problems we were talking about before. Europe has a fundamental problem, which is, first of all, that of having the raw materials to produce artificial intelligence. And just to give you an idea, the gap in 2024, when we had basically the peak in the use of artificial intelligence, a private U.S. company had 15 times more calculation capacity, computational capacity, which is basically the raw material needed to train AI, than the entire European Union altogether. And if we then branch out and consider the number of players who can actually train these models, well, then in that case, Europe was even less visible. Thanks to the progress made by chips produced by NVIDIA and other providers, we have a last version called Blackwell in the case of NVIDIA. We are basically having a performance which is 30 times higher with a consumption that is 25 times less. So this made it possible for Europe to invest a number of billions, enabling about the presence of 15 supercomputers in Europe. Europe has always been on the forefront since the academic sector invested through the Cineca sector in Leonardo, which is one of the most important supercomputers in Europe and the world. And now we not only have Leonardo, there's 15 of these supercomputers, and they're planning to have even more. So based on these bases, on these premises, based on the fact that we have an increasing availability of raw material, I believe we have to be more optimistic on the fact that Europe is acknowledging this gap and trying to bridge it with tangible investments. Based off this, we at Domyn candidated to, in a way, train a frontier model to produce an AI which is pan-European, which fairly represents over 24 countries, and which uses this publicly available computational power. We're talking about over 50,000 chips to train a model, which is the size of Anthropic or AI. It takes about 10,000. In Europe, we have 50,000 chips. So if we bring this calculation capacity together, then we manage to produce a very competitive AI. And that's the very same objective of the Europa consortium, together with the Fraunhofer Institute. So we basically submitted a technical project that creates a federation of these mega computers, creates a super European calculation that will help us basically train a model with over 3 million parameters, that is to say, a model capable of competing with China and the United States. We won this competition about 2 months ago, competing with the French and a number of other labs besides us. And we're proud to say that the European artificial intelligence will be led by Italians. And we're very optimistic, we're very confident of the fact that we can achieve very good results thanks to this calculation capacity. The very first tests we're carrying out this week are showing this. So I'd like to conclude by saying that if you make a difference between adoption and production in terms of adoption, Europe is bound to win, and we're working on the production side. But I am optimistic. Much has to be done, but I am sure that there can be a European proposition where rules become a competitive advantage to build a version of the artificial intelligence that you can trust. We are coming late, but that system is reliable. It meets the problems of our internal market. And again, I'm confident, we are confident that there will be also external demand for a reliable AI, as happens today. I mean, in China and the United States are buying from Italy products in the food sector, in design sector, and so on. That's very interesting, and we feel confident. So, Mr. Moavero and Milanese, Europe has been accused of a fact. I mean, raw materials are still a problem. So the human capital that the Vice Chancellor of Bocconi University mentioned is an issue. Oftentimes, Europe is accused to set rules that create an obstacle for competitive innovation. In this case, listening to Uljan Shark, this is true, but only to a certain extent. And I'd like to ask you, to what extent is it true? Good afternoon, everyone. The limits of the European Union are basically linked to its fragmentation. It is, however, also true that the European Union, especially when it comes to new technologies like AI, the European Union is a non-irrenounceable reference point, because it would be impossible to work at a national level, at least when it comes to Europe, because there are lots of countries, lots of small countries, which taken individually would not count that much, would not matter that much. At the same time, Europe, in spite of all its limitations, has been the very first aggregation of countries at a world level to draft targeted legislation in the field of artificial intelligence. And so new pieces of legislation, on the one hand, that's basically the ideal target for criticism. However, the EU legislation on artificial intelligence basically foresees an analysis and a preventive assessment when it comes to the release on the market of AI systems. So a preventive assessment of the risks that that same system can imply. So we're talking about a preventive risk assessment. That means that we are assessing the possible risks that, let's say, a given car may represent on the market. This analysis, this risk analysis, of course, also foresees bans and related sanctions, and this makes this regulation, this piece of regulation, not so popular. Nobody, at least in principle, likes to be sanctioned or to receive a fine when we drive our car. However, it is also true that these sanctions are necessary to try and maintain order. Bans refer to elements, to things which are quite obvious, so pornography or misleading messages, or also the fact that if you are dealing with a generative AI system producing images, as a user, I need to have the possibility to identify them as images which are not true, but rather generated by artificial intelligence. So as was also said by our the entrepreneur who is actually working on the field and actually is actually competing with other companies. All these aspects provide a reference framework that may be used by Europe both to protect itself when it comes to non-European systems which do exist in the digital world, and also to develop models and alternative models and systems. In this respect, there's two considerations. First, this is not the only piece of legislation in Europe that addresses the issue of the field of artificial intelligence. There's many more. There's general ones like the European regulation on digital markets or the European regulation on digital services. Then there's also further general legislation like the European rules on competition. These are all legislative rules that have a direct influence on these markets and systems. There's a EU directive. This is a specific example which is quite enlightening. So a European directive that concerns the work of labor on digital platforms. This is the directive that enabled to provide a status to many workers working on digital platforms. For example, the guys who do home delivery, or many other people whom we daily meet. I mean, all of them, their working conditions are disciplined by this directive, which also deals with the ban of decision-making through algorithms. So when it comes, for example, to advancements, career advancements, or wage increases and so on. This cannot be taken with artificial intelligence. I believe that this is particularly important and useful for Europe, which are not to be related with the frenzy that Europe has to legislate, but rather to the fact that there is a raison d'être for these regulations. Other aspect, we need to focus on the content of these regulations and also on the effectiveness. I mean, these are all very recent pieces of legislations released between 2023 and 2024 onwards. So we'll have to check if they are effective in practice. And then there's a second very important test for Europe, and this has this was not mentioned by the entrepreneur, which is that of resources. For Europe, I mean, becoming competitive in the field of artificial intelligence and then overcoming this difficult situation means investing financial resources, both private, public. We need to find them in the financial statements of the countries. We need actually to allocate these resources of the European Union, and here the European Parliament may play an important role. And then we need to basically provide a financial driving engine enabling us to basically overcome this vulnerability, this additional vulnerability that Europe has in a sector which, like it or not, will be fundamental in the future.
Allora, Pina Picierno.
So, Pina Picierno, you listened to a number of considerations and to experiences. What are the most urgent matters that the Parliament should discuss to support entrepreneurs? And can you also say something about the first contribution? How come that how can Europe support the training of such important human capital, which is so smart, which is humanly so intelligent that it can create competitive innovation? First of all, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to be here. And thanks to the other speakers for such an interesting debate on this urgent topic. So what's Europe's urgent matter? I believe that Europe's urgency mainly lies in trying to find a European way, as our entrepreneur said. I really appreciated your contribution very much. So a European way between the way suggested by the so-called digital predators and the techno-optimists. So those who tell us that every innovation would produce in any case and in any way positive progress for mankind. There's a number of intellectuals, of scholars who come to help. Yuval Harari, for example, who talked about the history of mankind through evolution, through the evolution of its IT system. And Harari told us that lots of technologies, before being used and producing positive effects, actually created disruption. He reminded us that writing was not invented to write poems, but rather to, in a way, take note of the taxes, of the fees that the poorest had to pay for the richest in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, for example. He told us that the invention of the print characters certainly determined the, so to say, the emergence of public opinion as we know it now. Do you know what the most popular book was at the time when the digital print, when print was invented? It was not Copernico, but rather the Malleus Maleficarum. In other words, a book which told how had to be tortured and because they were witches, and burnt because they were witches. So this is telling us that technology is not always neutral. Technology needs rules, as was said before, and it is our decisions, our choices that actually indicate the way that technology can take. So Europe did well in defining a perimeter of rules, a framework of rules needed to guide this technology, which represents a much deeper, a much more complex technological leap, because it addresses the very same cognitive structure of our societies. In other words, on the way intelligence is organized and transmitted, but also produced. So this modification needs rules which are capable of guiding them, because this technology, for example, is present on the relationship between knowledge, truth, freedom, and authority. So it basically relates to the very same concept of sovereignty. Less and less does sovereignty depend on territorial control, and it's quite the opposite. It depends on the control of the cognitive space. So we need to be autonomous, we need to develop a strategic autonomy. So in this respect, the proposal of having a European artificial intelligence is fundamental. If Europe, if a continent, depend in its decision-making on knowledge produced elsewhere and by others, this technological heterogeneity becomes political. It becomes legislative, and we cannot afford that. That's why we need a European way. So we cannot do without the regulation part, but that's fundamental. For example, when we talk about rules, Bernhard said before, it is said that the rules limit competitiveness. But when we needed a vaccine to preserve our health, we applied to Russian vaccines produced not in compliance with the rules we had, or to the European vaccines that were produced in accordance and in compliance with shared rules. I mean, rules are needed because rules means guarantee for effectiveness, and yet they're not enough. We also need to produce capacity. Skills, I mean, technological capacities. This is what our businessman said. We're talking about scientific, innovative capacities as well as cultural ones. And from this point of view, I think the Chancellor said very, very important things. We need to produce autonomy and capacity also from a cultural point of view and political one. What allows us to be confident towards the future is the possibility of making shared decisions. So the distinction that was done by the Pope in writing this wonderful encyclical on artificial intelligence was very good, because he provided us a very adequate and meaningful framework. Before that, before the encyclical, the discussion on artificial intelligence was carried out only within merely economic and technological discussion. And finally, the Pope provided meaning, provided culture, and a political framework for this discussion. So the distinction that he makes between the Tower of Babel and this willingness to continue building outside any rule at any cost without sharing knowledge, and also the building of the walls of Jerusalem contained in the book of Nehemiah. So we're still there, and with this perimeter in mind, we need basically to look at the challenges posed by artificial intelligence and more generally the future. Thank you.
I would like now to invite Massimiliano Salini to include in his answer a particularly important topic in competitiveness, that is energy. Because we know that raw materials are an issue by themselves, but we also have an energy issue. If we don't have energy, we cannot support any kind of economy. Well, the central element is this. I apologize for my voice, but the meeting has a number of negative effects, I'm afraid. But luckily, the positive ones prevail. My voice today is one of those negative effects. Well, I'll try to focus my answer on the issue that you have just mentioned, which is one of the pillars of competitiveness, that is energy. But before doing that, I think there is something useful to be mentioned too. Let's consider what was mentioned in the first presentation about the demography. Now, one of the points that should be considered at European level is also highlighted by one of the non-positive dynamics of demography. It is true that we have a record in terms of inhabitants, 450 million now. We had 370 million in 1950, but in 1950 we had 2.5 billion people in the world, and today we have 8.5 billion people in the world. So there's so many of us. We are more than we were in 1950, but there are so many more people in the world. We are 8.5 billion inhabitants in the world. So why is it so that Europe is growing less? This is a question that should be considered, because it is also an economic problem. The demographic evidence is tragic in a way, because there is lower growth with respect to the rest of the world, but also, considering the economic scenario, there are similar things going on. Many reasons also concern politics. But basically, the point is that in Europe, there is no investment. Now, something new may be happening in the field of artificial intelligence, but what happens in Europe is that the existing things are consolidated. But real new investments in strategic sectors are carried out outside the European Union. So we have an interesting demographic dynamic, but it is insufficient considering the rest of the world. And we have a dynamic considering the investments that is totally unsatisfactory. And one of the signs of this strong crisis is really about energy. We have little energy in Europe, and it is so expensive, much more expensive than it is outside Europe. And it is a tragedy, because Europe doesn't have many raw materials, and it is a continent whose possibility to create value depends on its possibility to produce and to transform. We can't stop producing or processing because we don't have raw materials. And we need energy to do that. And energy costs double the price that it costs in other parts of the world. So we have a mature continent with a well-educated human capital, but what is the reason behind this slow pace of growth, including the demographic field? There is a problem of little intelligence. The meeting has highlighted this with the myth of Pradas. Intelligence is intus legere or interlegere, that is, the capacity of entering, considering relations. The artificial one is not true intelligence, real intelligence. The human one is real intelligence. What does characterize intelligence in describing the phenomenon of relations? What is a relation? Where does relation come from? It comes from freedom, and Pina mentioned that, linking to sovereignty. So where is it that European rules have failed? Some rules really generated a lot of value. They were successful. Let me digress a little bit. In the previous legislation, we worked on the regulation of digital platforms and considering the issue of copyright, because the big digital platforms were not paying royalties. And the reason for that was that digital platforms provide services for free. So one gets access to the information provided by the digital platform without paying. Okay, but the argumentation then was that we don't want to pay royalties because users use services for free. But then the unlimited number of contacts was exploited by digital platforms for advertisements, and advertisements were sold at very high prices. So the lack of payment of royalties generated enormous profits because of the sale of adverts in view of that incredible increase in the number of contacts that had been generated by the provision of information services that somebody generated anyway, and that had to be paid, because the lack of payment of copyright is that the newspapers cannot send journalists in conflict zones, for example, because they don't have money to pay them. It means that there's just a young guy who's paid €5 per interview doing that. So the quality of information lowers, and also the quality of democracy lowers, because when there is low quality, then there is low democracy. So that rule regulation on copyright is an excellent regulation. It is not just a constraint. It gave Europe the freedom of information, but the regulation for limiting technology in the automotive field, for example, has a defect. And what is the defect? Going back to the topic of liberty. Basically, it manages risk by fearing it. It constrains risk, not containing the negative effect, but the positive effect, which is freedom. That is, it invests in the idea that the more you let them free, there may be damages to the people managing those processes. However, the key point in European history was believing in the subjects as a subject capable of establishing relations of freedom. So the relational dimension is a key factor in the European project, and that's where we decided to slow down. So the key element on which it is necessary to regenerate, not with just regulations and constraints. Some people insist in reducing the number of laws, but it's not a matter of quantity. No, 10 rules more, 1 rule less. It's not a question of how many rules we have. The question is the criterion which is used to prepare those rules. So if we want to reduce risk intended as a reduction of liberty, inevitably there will be a competition for the lack of growth. Whereas if you want to run a risk, well, that's one of the funding elements of the founding fathers of the European Union. That is, investing in the creative dimension of people, financing them, and relaunching the history of people that were dead. Now, one more risk I'm going to take now, because I want to ask one more question, but we have to be quick. First, Vice-Chancellor, first you talked about the collaboration with the university. We know that if we don't work together, we have heard this from all the panelists, no value can be generated, nor intellectual nor innovative. Is it imaginable? It is imaginable. I can give you an European example that was mentioned in the Draghi report. The European Council is an excellent institution that works because Europeans got together. No country alone could generate such a level of knowledge and quality as the one that has been generated at the European Union level, with many associate countries. The UK became member of the Research Council as a collaboration, Israel too. So this is knowledge that results from collaboration. We don't have this same transfer from research to the establishment of businesses. We have heard what our colleague Sharka said. That's where we lose with respect to the US, because we fragment ourselves. The creation of business is still an issue in Europe. Then a question to Sharka, Mr. Sharka, immediately. How can you comment? What would you say on this observation? How can you create that human intelligence in your business? What is your resource? Well, I agree with what has been said. I believe that integration now suffers from a lack of investment. That is, Europe has even more financial resources than the United States if you consider numbers and liquidity. Europe has 10,000 billion of liquidity with respect to the 7-8 of the US. So In theory, the capital is bigger thanks to the stock exchange and the technological boom, but there is a problem of leadership. These resources are not directed in a programmatic and systemic way. There is not one-shot initiative, but an ecosystem approach. Insofar as we don't have pan-European initiatives, we won't go anywhere. That's the point on which we must work. Moavero Milanesi, would the member states be prone to follow this direction? Yes, I agree on this. I think this can be the way. It is the way that should be pursued. And again, let's go back to the underlying topic, that is regulations. We need appropriate laws. We need appropriate regulations that give a framework, because without them it is difficult to operate and it is difficult to get free of the subjugation of other powers. So on this we can all agree. Now, Mr. Beccari, what is the role of San Marino in the value chain in terms of its contribution? Well, certainly it is a place where it is possible and possibly it is easier to do business. It doesn't mean that there are no rules there. It means that operations are streamlined, which has always been our main asset for a long time. We cannot avoid considering what happens beyond our borders. Many points have been mentioned, as we said before, energy costs, but also funding. The US, at the level of the central government, doesn't invest one single euro in the economy. It's all financed by the private sector. So we need a collective effort to invert the paradigm in this sense and to encourage the system through banks, through investors, and give support to business initiatives. Otherwise, the gap will be so big that we cannot fill it. Thank you. Same question to the MEPs. In one way or another, you said that Europe must orient, and to orient operationally, we need funding. Is it appropriate? Is it something that can be expected to have a more considerable budget? Would it cause a decision-making conflict that is worse than before? Well, I really agree totally with you. I think last year we discussed this with Max, and of course with this European budget we are talking about ridiculous numbers. It is not up to the standard of the huge challenges that we have to face. And it's not that we should face them, we must face them. So a change in the choices, in the setting up, in the way of interpret things is not just to be expected, but it is fundamental, I would say. Indeed, that is the case, and Mr. Moavero mentioned that earlier. We have a European budget infrastructure that tells us that the member states decided not to invent in the European project, the budget that is 1% of the GDP, and with a particular thing that is almost disgusting in my view. Member states complain of European rules to use the money, but they keep the cash for themselves. If I wanted to intervene in a company because that business interests me, I would have to buy the stocks of that company, and I would become part of the governance, and I would start defining the rules in a life in which I want to participate. I can't understand why in politics we want to adopt different criteria. If we want to change the rules of the game, we have to play the rules of the game, and we need to invest more to have a common good that is more supported. Thank you all. just to sum up what has emerged this evening is that Europe can do it, and this is not to be taken for granted, because many say that people won't make it, that Europe is lost, it is in decline, but we can do it. It can compete, it has specific features that are not owned by others, but it has to wake up. And if today's session has been helpful in this awakening, well, we will be very grateful. Thank you.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.
È iniziata l'era della fibra di Open Fiber, l'era di enti e imprese più digitali, dove i servizi sono sempre accessibili e il territorio è monitorato in tempo reale. Attiva la fibra con il tuo operatore di fiducia su openfiber.it. Vivi l'era della fibra.
Quello che state per intraprendere è un viaggio nel tempo, un percorso dei ricordi attraverso oggetti che nel passato facevano parte della nostra quotidianità, ma che il progresso ha consegnato all'oblio.
Luisa.
Carlo.
Buon compleanno.
Cos'è sto posto? Mi manca. Mi vuoi sposare?
Sono Orogel. Sono pronto ad accogliervi con verdure dal sapore unico che scaldano il cuore. Pronto a farvi sentire i profumi della campagna, anche in città. Ad essere il tocco di gusto alle vostre ricette. Orogel, non solo pronto, pronto a tutto.
È iniziata l'era della fibra di Open Fiber, l'era di enti e imprese più digitali, dove i servizi sono sempre accessibili e il territorio è monitorato in tempo reale. Attiva la fibra con il tuo operatore di fiducia su openfiber.it. Vivi l'era della fibra.
Quello che state per intraprendere è un viaggio nel tempo, un percorso dei ricordi attraverso oggetti che nel passato facevano parte della nostra quotidianità, ma che il progresso ha consegnato all'oblio.
Luisa.
Carlo.
Compleanno.
Cos'è sto posto? Mi manca. Non vuoi sposare?
Sono Orogel. Sono pronto ad accogliervi con verdure dal sapore unico che scaldano il cuore. Pronto a farvi sentire i profumi della campagna, anche in città. Ad essere il tocco di gusto alle vostre ricette. Orogel, non solo pronto, pronto a tutto.